All right, great. I think we're live. So I'm really excited to welcome Dan Rothstein, a wonderful friend and colleague, to this first, I don't know, we're calling this, what are we going to call this? A salon of some sort, a conversation. Dan and I have known each other for maybe about 4 years now, I think. I came to a workshop here in Chicago that Dan and his business partner, Liz Santana, were doing with Chicago Public School teachers for the Right Question Institute that Dan founded, and was really taken with your methodology. And then we connected over our shared Jewishness and love of Judaism and Hebrew. And it's become an annual ritual now that, before Pesach, you and I wind up, corresponding. What questions are you asking at the Seder, and what questions are you asking at the Seder? And we always say we should really write a Haggadah, and we never seem to have time. So this year we thought at least we could have a chavruta here online and share this with our nearest and dearest. And Dan, I'll let you introduce, sort of what the Right Question Institute is in the QFT. What I will just say by way of introduction is that, I often refer to you as, another person in the question business. And I think one of the reasons clearly why Pesach and the Seder are so important to both of us is that, of course, this is a night of questions. And in fact, that the Talmud, in fact, instructs that it's not just if you of course, if you have the youngest child present, that they ask questions, or that Maimonides talks about that you have to arrange things in such a way that children will provoke questions. But really that even if the Talmud mentions that even if you're by yourself and there's nobody else around, you still have to ask the question, what makes this night different, and you have to answer the story. The story of the Exodus has to be an answer to a question. So there's something very deeply woven into the DNA of the Seder and of Passover to value question asking and conversation about questions. And so today we wanted to share some ideas from you and from us here at Aspect Questions about how we can enrich our Sedarim if we are Seder leaders through asking better questions. So Dan, why don't you tell us a little bit about, Right Question Institute, and then let's jump into how you've been using your work in the context of leading your Sedarim over the last many years.
Sure, Josh, it's great to talk with you. I've been inspired by your work, and you're right. It's great to have more people in the question business. It's there's a need for it. So something that occurred to me while you were talking now is that in describing our work, there's a connection to the Seder that leaps out at me that I hadn't really thought of before. And that is that the Seder emphasizes the Haggadah emphasizes the importance of questions, yet the need to emphasize that so much is almost a recognition that sometimes people have a problem asking questions. And the need to find these ingenious, creative, provocative, strange, weird ways, dipping twice, make all this effort to try to shake it up. So what happens? What's the result? People ask questions. So in other words, there's a recognition in the Haggadah that we should not assume that everybody comes ready to ask questions. We shouldn't assume that all people are comfortable asking questions. And as much as we might all joke about how Jews, answer a question with another question, and Jews are comfortable asking questions, there's still a wide range of people who feel more comfortable asking questions than others. And in a social environment, very often, people are concerned or inhibited to ask questions because they're fearful that maybe this will be considered a stupid question, or they'll be laughed at. So that's one piece of it, that the Haggadah is actually recognizing that there's a challenge that needs to be addressed. Mm-hmm. And then the second one is, how do you actually make room for more voices around the Seder table? Mm-hmm. And is it merely just going around and everybody reading a paragraph and the youngest reading the 4 questions? Or might there be other ways to actually engage people in thinking? And so that's really the background to how I've applied the work of the Right Question Institute and the question formulation technique to the Seder, on how do we create those opportunities and make it easier for more people to share. So the work of the Right Question Institute evolved from working with parents in one low-income community who named a problem that nobody had ever really named. They said they weren't involved in their children's education, they weren't participating, weren't coming to the schools because they didn't even know what to ask. So we thought, that's easy, we can solve that problem, we can give you a list of questions. But of course, that only created greater dependency. So what the parents named was something profoundly important, is that not knowing what to ask can be an obstacle to participation, obstacle to self-advocacy. So that's how we got to work. We've worked for more than 20 years in many different communities all around the country and now around the world. We've seen extraordinary work done with the question formulation technique, thanks to our book that came out a few years ago and is now used by teachers in classrooms from Appalachia to the lab school in Chicago to Harvard, to the Los Angeles Unified School District, Chicago Public Schools. So lots of different places are using it, and we're learning.
You just got back from Japan, and it's all the way.
That's right.
Right above your left shoulder, which are so for folks looking can see.
Yes, yes, that's right. That's right. In fact, I can even show you. I can even show you the Japanese version.
Oh wow! There it is.
Yeah, which was very exciting to see in bookstores, and people very excited about it. So something has happened, and I think that it's taken off because it's a very simple process that I'll explain to you, and you'll see how simple it is, but it produces some pretty extraordinary results. The simplicity is that you create a focus for people's questions. You don't ask a question of them, but a focus for their questions, the question focus. Then they use a set of 4 rules for producing their questions, to ask as many questions as they can, to not stop to judge, discuss, or answer the first question that comes up, to write down every question exactly as stated, and to change any statements into questions. They use those rules, then they go on to they produce questions, then they look at their own questions and categorize them into open questions closed-ended questions that can be answered with yes or no or one word, or open-ended questions that require more explanation. They practice changing them. Then they prioritize based on some instructions on how to prioritize, which can be as simple as, what are the 3 most important questions for you? And they prioritize the questions, and they get a chance to think about how they could use these questions and what they learned by asking questions. So they're actually doing 3 kinds of thinking in one process. They're doing divergent thinking, thinking broadly, convergent thinking, prioritizing, synthesizing, and they do some metacognition, thinking about how they're thinking and what they are learning. So that's it. That's the process. And so it's worked, from kindergarten through higher education to medical school and beyond. Mm-hmm. So I can just share with you an example of how I used it at a Seder in my house. So let me give you an example of, a simple question focus. And maybe we should spend a moment and even take 20 seconds of silence and work on what are some questions that come from this. So the question focus that I had, and I actually had people split up into different groups in order to talk about this. Sorry. And people split up in different groups, and they had their own process of asking questions about it. And the question focus was, we were slaves, now we are free. Mm-hmm. So what kinds of questions do you think come up from that?
It's interesting that I actually shared this question, this focus, with my staff team this morning in the context of the article that we were reading. Right. You talked about this question, this prompt, as the focus for the 1804 Haitian Revolution. Which is awesome.
Right.
So I think some questions that come up are clearly, how do we become slaves? Who's we? What does free mean? And when is now? Are we now free, or is this talking about some other kind of free, or other kind of moment? Those are a few that immediately come to mind.
Yeah. It's so interesting to see, and going in different directions. I had a question about what does it mean to be a slave? How is it different now? how did it happen? How am I different? What do I do now? So there's that kind of range that you hear when you hear people asking, and they're looking at different pieces of it. So part of what we talk about is that in the design of a question focus, you want some hooks for people to be asked questions about those different pieces of the question focus. So in the first part, you have we were slaves. So there's already a historical statement there. And there's a concept, there's an idea about being slaves, and there's already a message that we were slaves. And then comma, we're changing time frames, and it's now. And like you said, what does now mean? We are free. And so then there's plenty of room for then asking questions about what does it mean to be free? What does it look like? What does it feel like? And I loved your question about now. What is now?
Yeah, right. What is this moment?
Yeah,
and are we talking about? Does now refer to a moment 2,000, 3,000 years ago, or does now refer to
right
now? And is we us physically here, or are we as a people? Yeah,
right. And think about how potent that is for a communal experience in which you are supposed to feel as if you yourself were liberated from Egypt. As if you yourself were taken out of Egypt. And so the now just resounds with that entire realm of what the Passover, the Seder experience is supposed to be. Wow, right now. And so what does it mean? And then I think that, this year, I think in particular, there's a piece that I would like to explore, and I think it might connect with your work, is where you do such good thinking about questions that can actually get people thinking in new ways. It occurs to me coming out of this conversation is that there's another word that we should be thinking about, and that is responsibility. So now that we are free, what responsibility do we have?
Yeah.
And that, of course, resonates with one of the messages of Passover, is to recognize that because we were slaves, we need to have a greater sensitivity and understanding to suffering.
Which, and of course, comes through itself in the Torah, Ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. You were strangers in the land of Egypt, and that's the rationale for, so many commandments in the Torah.
Right, absolutely. So, yeah. So I just wanted to tell you that one of the most enjoyable moments in any of the seminars we did was the one I was in Chicago, when you were there, and I was reviewing that when people produce their own questions, improve their questions, and strategize on how to use them, is I used a little refrain that you really picked up on, you liked. I said, if people only produce their questions, which is a rare thing for them, that would be sufficient. If people produce their questions and improve them, that would be already in advance. If people produced, improved, and strategized on the question, dayenu.
Yeah.
So, but I just remember you were the person in the room whose head was, you knew what was going on.
I caught the cadence.
Yeah.
So you've used that in your own Seder in your living room.
Yeah.
And so you got people to generate these questions. You were, I think, doing it, as you mentioned, with you were having people write them out, is what you usually do. We were talking earlier about what do you do if you're Shomer Shabbat, or right, if you don't. So even just the process of asking them without writing them down,
right,
still extremely valuable.
Yeah.
Right? And then have you gone through, so the rest of the steps for you, right, that include, so moving back and forth between open and closed, right, showing what you can do with different types of questions, and then getting the group to prioritize what are like sort of the three key questions, or, the group of essential questions we really want to prioritize here.
Right.
And then deciding on next steps from there.
Right.
Now, have you used that have you used all of that as part of the Seder, or because the Seder also has its own trajectory, then like, this is what you got to eat, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I mean, it actually can move pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And I think you can make some decisions about how much reading are you going to do? How much do you want to then give people an opportunity to choose a question to talk further about? Or you can use that part as a way to inform people's thinking as they now move through the rest of the Haggadah. And then they're already seeing questions that they ask that are now related to what is being told in the Haggadah, the telling of the story. And they also are more inclined to generate new questions. So it changes the dynamic from hoping that somebody's going to ask a question, hoping that one question just doesn't become the sole question that's discussed the whole evening, hoping that more people are participating. So it just eases people into that whole environment that you want to create.
So what's so great about this is I think that it lays the groundwork and it intersects with what we do at Aspect Questions also so beautifully, because the way we define, our major sort of distinction, if we have a QFT, it's oriented around this idea of hard questions and big questions, and that hard questions are questions that matter to everyone, and only some people can answer specifically. You have to think you have enough expertise to answer the question, versus big questions are questions that matter to everyone, that everyone can answer. And we find that, I found over the years that so much of our education system, our politics, our media is really set up around hard questions, because it allows people to show their expertise, demonstrate how smart they are, et cetera, right? And it leads to debates that are really about sort of politics and posturing. And I've certainly been to my share of Seders where it seems like the unspoken goal is to show how smart you are. And that doesn't generally lead to creating an atmosphere where people can really engage, right? Where they're actually genuinely engaging with the story and with each other. So, even the question of, I think of towards the end of the Magid section, there's the three questions of Rabban Gamliel, right? Of Pesach Zel Shumma. Why do we have this symbol and this symbol and this symbol? And there's a scripted answer for that. And it's asking, what is the definitive meaning of these symbols, rather than asking the question, well, what could these symbols mean to you?
Right.
And so I think that there's something really important about, first of all, empowering everyone at the Seder table to ask their questions. And then the work of, as a group, finding the ones that matter most to all of us, that bring out our stories, right? Those are probably going to wind up being what we would refer to as big questions. And so, and as you said, for whom are we responsible? Where do we feel at home? How do we use our power? Those kind of questions, which I find are the ones, that we come back to again and again. They're really at the heart of the Seder. I mean, it gets to a lot of the core questions that we have. Right. I'm also really, I've also been really struck about I think especially now, the language that you use to describe the work of the Right Question Institute is, exercises in micro-democracy. Okay. And as I understand that, I think that's about two things. I think number one, from what I can tell, is that's about the basic right and responsibility of citizens and members of a democracy to ask questions, right, and not simply to receive answers, but to generate questions. We are the ones who generate the questions. And number two is in the negotiation among a group of people around a table or in a community or a society, prioritizing the questions, deciding which questions do we share and which are most important to us as a group, right? That's the work of a democracy. And I think, I wrote an essay a couple of years ago about that, drawing on, I think, on Parker Palmer, that the Seder is really, to me, a renewal of Jewish citizenship. It's when we reconnect with our story.
Very nice. Very nice.
Our membership in the Jewish people. And I think that this, this tool of being able to ask our own questions, is really at the heart of it, and maybe is exactly why the Haggadah, prescribes that why it's so important to the Haggadah.
Right. Well, yeah, and kind of, I think that it's interesting because the Haggadah can also be alienating for people who, in a sense, want to dive deeply into the meaning of Passover and get waylaid by lots of details that they don't quite understand why this is connected. And and so I think it's a challenge. And you always have different ages, you have different audiences, you have different levels of knowledge, backgrounds of knowledge. So there's a lot that's very, very tricky there. So one of the things that we have found with the question formulation technique in lots of environments is that it actually democratizes the learning environment, so that the idea of asking questions is actually honoring not knowing. So the child who, did not even know what to ask, that child create a process so that child who did not know how to ask learns how to ask. And so it's really that invitation. And you have, you what you just described is you have that in the four children, and who's the wise ass, and who's the, right, and these belong to you, they don't belong to me. The sense of responsibility, it's all there. So there really are ways to take different elements of the Seder that you may not know quite what to make of, and turn it into a question focus where you could just, you could do this also informally. You don't have to go through all the steps, but you could say, all right, so the child who says, what do these mean to you, is, let's just ask some questions about that question. And you turn that into a question focus. And so that way you get to hear people's different ideas about what you're reading as you're engaging with that Haggadah. So it's the kind of thing that you can use on the fly to do that.
Yeah, that's great.
And especially when, people are kind of slowing down and the stomachs are rumbling, there's like giving people the opportunity to participate changes the energy level in the room.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, the last thing I'll just say is, that I, for the years that I was a rabbi at Northwestern, every year I would run a Seder leader workshop, right, for students who were leading Seders. And I think one thing that people get really caught on is like, do I have to recite the whole thing? Do we have to read it? And I really encourage everybody, to realize that the Haggadah is a suggestion. I mean, there's some core stuff that it says that you need to do, but otherwise, depending on your level of fidelity, there's so much room and encouragement, right, for creativity and participation. And even the Talmud, I remember, I'll wrap up with this story. I remember that my oldest son, who's now 14, the first year we were here, so he must have been, 2-3 years old. And we were having a Seder in our apartment. We had about 20 students gathered around a table, and he was standing there in the middle holding court. And he was just talking about a story. And at one point, he, as we were getting started, he says, "Abba, I've got a question." I said, "What's your question?" He said, "How come most of the time on Shabbat we have challah, but tonight we're having matzah?" It was like completely, it was just so, and I said, there you go. I mean, the Talmud actually says, now we don't have to ask the 4 questions.
Exactly.
You opened it up. But I think, from that level of just the ability to notice something and creating room for people to state, exactly, I noticed this and it's different, to putting out a question that is not designed as a question that is meant to show how smart I am, how clever this is, but instead is a question shared in generosity, right, and is meant to open up room for dialogue and conversation and connection. I think that, to me, that's really what the goal is and what the most successful stream are. So I think you've just created a magnificent tool for being able to do that. And so I really encourage anybody who's watching or listening to this, to go check out, Make Just One Change, the book up behind Dan's shoulders, whether you read Japanese or not. And Dan, this has been such a treat and a pleasure, and thank you for taking the time to share this. And I trust that one day we will get to writing that Haggadah.
I think so, definitely. Yeah. Before we end, can I just share with you a question focus that I used last year was people from an older crowd from teens through adults. And I think that they were ready for a more complicated question focus. And when I looked at it again this year and I thought about where we are, I thought you might want to hear it. And my concluding comments. Yeah. And it actually comes from Michael Walzer's book, Exodus and revolution. And so the question focus is more complicated. It's 3 conclusions from the Exodus story. 1, wherever you live is probably Egypt. 2, there is a better place, a promised land. And 3, the way to go to this promised land is through the wilderness.
Mm. Wow.
So it's great to be on the journey with you now through the wilderness.
All right. Wonderful. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.
Have a wonderful Pesach. Thank you so much. And I'm going to stop our recording.
Great.
All right.